Fishing was originally a way to gather food, and in my mind, it's still an excellent reason to spend some time on the water. So we're going to talk about some of my favorite ways to cook fish that I catch on this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. I'm Chad LaChance, and you're listening to Fishful Thinker, the podcast. All things fishful, all the time. Hey guys, Chad LaChance here. Thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Fishful Thinker, the podcast. Of course, brought to us, as always, by the fine folks at Sportsman's Warehouse. Visit them at sportsmans.com or any one of 140 plus stores nationwide. Also, for you Northern Colorado thinkers, stop in Peterson Toyota, check out a Tundra or Tacoma or Sequoia to tow your boat, and tell them I told you to stop in. Those dudes all love to fish, so talk some fishing and boating with them while you're there. Guys, I dearly love to cook, and I understand that this is a fishing podcast, but I'd be willing to bet that a high percentage of you that like to fish also like to eat some fish. And cooking for me, particularly as I've gotten older and older, is very close second in my life to being in the outdoors. It's almost an integral part at this point in my life, to such that I look forward to hunting season, not so much even for the harvesting and the actual hunt, but in the processing of whole big game animals and rabbits and all the other stuff that I harvest and eat. And the same thing happens with fish. And I'll be the first to admit that I don't harvest and eat a lot of fish, mostly because I only eat fish if it's completely fresh. And call me a snob, call me whatever you want, but the fish is much better if it's completely fresh. And so, given that I have the luxury of fishing on a relatively regular basis, if I do decide I want to eat some fish, I'll try to catch those fish at that time. I'm a big fan of selective harvest in general. I do not eat limits of fish. I'm not a big fan of we limit it out every time I go out. Not my thing, but I'm not judging. If that's you, that's fine. I'm just setting the grounds of where I come from. So for me, if I want fish, it needs to be fresh for the most part. Having said that, I will for sure freeze some fish. It's just that I will prepare those fish in the kitchen differently than I would if I was going to, to eat it or cook it some other ways that was pure fresh right out of the lake. So that's a thing that I think is important. One piece of advice I will give you: if you're not able to eat fish that night, or maybe the second night after you catch it, I would go ahead and freeze it. I would not keep it in a refrigerator for 3 days. I'm not saying it'll go bad. I'm saying it won't be anywhere near the quality of the fish. So if I know I'm not going to eat fish, right away, I will freeze it as fast as possible. I want to get it cleaned and frozen as fast as I can get it frozen. The sooner it gets frozen, the better the quality of the fish will be when you thaw it out. If you leave it in the fridge for 2 days, then decide you're not going to eat it and then freeze it, it's not going to be as good a quality of fish. And so, assuming I have good quality pieces of fish, I have the most options of being able to cook that fish later on. The other thing is, if I am going to freeze fish or even just set it in the fridge overnight and eat it the next day, I always want to leave it in as big as pieces as possible, even if I know that, say, this fillet weighs 3 pounds off the side of a good sized fish, a big old saltwater fish or something, a 3 or 4 pound fillet. Obviously, I'm not going to cook it that way, but I'll leave it whole because that gives me the most options for cooking it later, and it exposes the least amount of the flesh to air. And the less air that gets on it, the better off it will be in most scenarios. So leaving it, and for the record, I do the same thing with big and small game as well. If I'm going to take a piece of elk loin, let's say, I'll probably freeze it in 1 pound chunks whole. I can cut it down into steaks later, or I can butterfly it or stuff it or whatever I want to do, but I'll leave that whole chunk of loin. It might be, say, a 4 or 5 inch long section of the loin. Well, I can still cut that down into 1 inch thick steaks if I want, or whatever after the fact, but I'll freeze it in a serving amount. In other words, however much you're going to cook, I will individually freeze that, but I won't cut it down any smaller. And I do the same thing with fish. Let's say I caught 20 crappies. I'm caught a limit of crappies, and I'm going to freeze them. I won't freeze all those together. I'll freeze them in amount that I intend to eat for one meal. So if you're feeding 2 people, in my case, I'm most often cooking for 2 people. Well, okay, that means I'm going to freeze enough for 2 people in each package that I freeze. And then if you have guests over, you can thaw multiple packages, but that way people give me fish on a regular basis, people from back east, and they'll give me a 3 or 4 pound bag of crappies. Well, that's fantastic and generous, but when I thaw that, I'm now committed to cooking 3 or 4 pounds of crappie fillets, and it's a whole 1 gallon Ziploc bag completely full of crappie fillets, which is a blessing, a wonderful thing to have, but then you're committed to a big giant fish fry. I would way rather have 4 bags of 1 pound each that I can thaw and cook that way from the practicality standpoint and keeping it in the fridge. The other thing is fish doesn't last long in the freezer compared to other things. I have no problem eating venison that's been wrapped in plastic and then paper, put in a food storage bag and then paper, or vacuum sealed and then paper, or even just a pure vacuum seal if you have a good quality vacuum sealer, and it'll hold a solid vacuum over time in the freezer. I know a lot of the cheaper ones will not, and then it will freezer burn, but I will definitely eat meat, venison, let's say, that's been in the freezer for a couple of years even. It doesn't freezer burn much, and if it does, that's not a big deal. Fish, on the other hand, will lose quality quickly, like a month. I don't really like to leave fish frozen at all if I can avoid it. So, enough of that as far as it goes. Let's talk about some preparations for the fish, and it's going to be obviously different with different fish. So any kind of fish that is a pure flaky white meat, so a crappie, a walleye, a bluegill, a bass if you're going to eat them. And by the way, yes, they're absolutely delicious. Large and smallmouth bass are delicious, and yes, I've eaten both of them. I understand most people don't eat them at all, but there's a lot of scenarios where harvesting some bass out of a system is better for the pond itself. And in one scenario of those, a friend of mine had a private pond that was overpopulated with little largemouth, and they were getting stunted and skinny, and they weren't growing well. Well, he went there in the wintertime and caught a whole bunch of them through the ice and filleted them off, and they were absolutely delicious. And they were like 12-inch long largemouth that he filleted, and they were fantastic. So any kind of fish like that, I'm going to treat different than any sort of salmonid that I would harvest. A trout, a salmon, a lake trout, anything like that, I'm going to treat fundamentally different. And it comes down basically to the oil content in the fish that makes the difference in that. So another thing is, if you're going to, in certain cases of fish, leaving the skin on for the freezing process will also protect some of the fish from being freezer burned or anything like that, because also the skin will keep the amount of fat. There's typically a fat layer between the skin, particularly on the salmonids, between the skin and the flesh, and that the more of that you leave, the better your final quality will be. Trout, if I'm going to freeze trout, I'll always freeze them whole, unless I catch some giant trout that I'm going to eat. I had a client kill one, and I'd make that sounds bad. I had a client catch one that died. Wasn't the client's fault. It was a 10+ pound trout, and I didn't want to freeze that whole, so I cut that into chunks and staked it like you would see salmon steaks rather than fillet it, and froze it that way. And that's something I will often do with either a really large trout if I'm going to harvest them if they die, or maybe even a lake trout or something like that. And of course, any kind of a salmon. We've all seen them staked as opposed to fillets. My general rule of thumb is, with anything, if you leave bones and fat and skin and all of those things on it, you get a better final product than if you have just a pure, clean piece of fish. Now, obviously, almost nobody does that with say, a bluegill or something like that, although there are a lot of places that freeze them whole, that fry them whole, and or cook them whole. And as a kid in Florida, we ate whole snapper often as well. So there are, which is typically a fish that you would fillet. But at any rate, there's definitely options when it comes to that. And if you're willing to deal with the bones after the fact, freezing fish whole or cooking fish whole will yield the best product, in my opinion, other than the bones. So that's a key thing right there as well. But let's talk about white flaky fish and the walleye, the crappie, the bluegill, the very commonly eaten fish. White bass is a key one for me. If I'm going to go harvest fish, I will typically make 1 or 2 trips a year specifically to target white bass, specifically to eat them, because they reproduce like rabbits. They're delicious. And it's just a really good all-around fish to eat. You're not going to hurt anything by eating a whole bunch of them, and they're delicious. Same thing with catfish in a lot of scenarios. Eating catfish really good if you're good at cleaning them. But let's talk with the nice white flaky fish. What am I going to do? Well, I'm getting ready to go to Minnesota, and in fact, I'm leaving here the next day or two to go to Minnesota, and I guarantee you we're going to fry some fish while we're there. Well, the fish camp that I'm staying at, it's not really a fish camp, it's a campground, but since we're going fishing, we're calling it a fish camp. There is a cleaning station, so we'll call it a fish camp. But the people around there eat a lot of fried fish. And I asked one of the guys, and I'm like, man, we got all these crappies. We gonna fry them or what? And he's like, well, I guess we could. And I was a little surprised that he was taken back. It was a local dude, and I was like, what do you mean? He goes, well, everybody always fries them. He's like, let's at least do something different. If you're gonna fry them for me, at least do something different. Okay, no problem. So in other words, I'm not gonna tell you to just plain fry fish. But if you're gonna, everybody loves a piece of fried fish, myself included. There's a couple of key things you might do differently that will make your fish really good. And typically you're going to do flour and then either eggs or milk or whatever for something like that. So you're going to flour the fish, then go in some sort of wet ingredient and then some sort of a dry ingredient again. That's a standard breading process, 3-step breading process, and then you'll go straight to the fryer. But you can still change that up a whole bunch. I'm still going to advocate using flour for the first step, and then maybe use egg wash for the second step, same egg wash in buttermilk or egg wash in milk or just plain egg or egg and water, whatever you're going to use for that. And then your final dredge that you're going to go in, you have an opportunity to put a bunch of things in. And almost everybody's heard of putting panko in there, which is just basically toasted breadcrumbs, and that's a great choice. It can be an excellent choice, but there's some other things that you might not think about that are excellent in breading for your fish, and one of them is really unique, and that's chicharrones. Get chicharrones at the store and crush them, and I mean crush them down into a dust, into a powder. And then put your fish in those. And so you go into the flour, go into the egg, then go into the chicharrones and fry them. First of all, it's a little more keto friendly, higher protein content as well. But second of all, it's really crunchy and really delicious. So I would season the chicharrones up just like you would for breading, whatever your favorite seasoning is, and then go ahead and roll those fish, like I said, flour, egg, and then into the chicharrones and into the fryer. Delicious. Another possibility you can put in there is called pan flour, P-A-N. Pan flour is basically pre-cooked white corn flour. And so you're probably familiar with cornmeal. And cornmeal to me is not ideal, at least in bulk in fish. And the reason being is it has a little bit of a gritty texture to it. A little bit of cornmeal goes a long way on fish for me. So typically if I'm going to use cornmeal in my breading, it will be mixed with flour or panko or whatever. It won't be straight cornmeal. Straight cornmeal makes for very kind of grainy, crunchy, too crunchy of fish. And so, but pan flour, which is similar to cornmeal in terms of flavor and things, but not quite so, what's the right word, rough, let's just say. It's finer, but it yields a very, very crunchy crust on there without that grittiness that comes from cornmeal, and it is delicious as well. Again, I would cut it with a little bit of flour, AP flour or rice flour. Rice flour works really good on fish for making it extra crispy. And another thing that works really good on fish that could be a good one as far as fried fish is to make sure you put a little bit of cornstarch or potato starch in your final dredge. And what that will do is make it extra crispy as well. And you make sure you just get that nice hard crunch on the outside of it. Couple key things: pat your fish as dry as you're going to pat it, as dry as you can pat it, I should say. You want that fish fillet to be as dry as you can get before you start a dredging process. So let's say you're going to start with fresh fish. I would pat it completely dry, lay it flat on a cookie sheet or whatever, put it in the fridge on plates, depending on how much you're doing, quarter sheet, whatever. Put it in the fridge and let it form a pellicle for a little bit, and it'll get almost tacky, same as if you were going to smoke it. And the reason that's important is you'll get the best adhesion of your flour and your whatever. You won't get so much steam out of the fish, and that steam is what will release your breading, and you'll take a bite of fish and the breading will come off separate, and we don't want that. So get it very dry. Also, I believe in seasoning every single layer. I've been a student of cooking my entire life since I was a little kid. I was the only child of a single mom, and I started cooking at a very young age. and season every step. So season the base flour, season your eggs, season your final dredge, and go from there. But the fish, very, very dry, a very light coating of the first flour, and then in your egg wash, and then in your final dredge from there, and go from there. A couple other variables that can be really good in this scenario. Instead of using anything eggy, if you want to use a very light batter and you want to be more along the lines of tempura, you can use something like ice cold beer as a dredge, or you can use just plain soda water or sparkling water of some kind, or Sprite, some kind of a soft drink for your liquid. So again, flour, and then into that, and then into your dredge. But any of those things will work well, and it'll provide a much lighter coating and a much crisper coating. Typically, if I'm going to do that, let's say I'm going to use sparkling water. So I'll go into single flour, sparkling water, and then into, in that case, rice flour and cornstarch. And that will make a very, very crispy, almost tempura style. Incidentally, you can just take that rice flour and cornstarch and mix it with that sparkling water and some seasoning, and just go straight to a tempura batter. Just mix it, the liquid in it, till it gets to enough where it'll just coat as much as you want. And in that case, if you're going to put the fish in the oil from there, I would dredge them immediately and put them straight into oil. As I do that, I would set them in the oil gently so that the coating can set as it goes into the oil. If you just drop them into the oil, they're going to sink to the bottom, and the coating is going to stick to your basket. So you've got to put them in there gently if you're going to go the route of batter. And I don't care what kind of batter it is. If you're going to use batter as opposed to breading, you need to put that fish down very gently into the oil. And incidentally, I always fry fish in very hot oil. Fish does not take long to cook. Even thick pieces of fish, I want them barely cooked all the way through. The biggest key with fish of any kind is don't overcook it. I want it barely cooked all the way through. The best fish for me will just barely flake apart and will still have a bunch of liquid in it. And so that typically means hot oil. So I want my oil to be 350, 360, 375 even, depending on how much fish I'm doing, how big the fryer is, things like that. I have a little deep fryer that I leave here at the house that I use, but I have no problem in using a cast iron Dutch oven and going old school and frying fish that way as well. In fact, in some cases, I think you get a better product in that case, because you're just more diligent in being on top of it, because it's not so automated. Plus, you can generally keep your heat more stable. Incidentally, if you're going to buy a fryer, buy one with a lot of BTUs, because all other things being equal, the volume of liquid is part of it, but the number of BTUs is a key thing. The more heat it has available, the more stable it will keep the temperature of the oil. And the more the oil stays at temperature, the better, more consistent fish you're going to get. So that's important. Also, let the oil come up to temperature between batches anytime you're going to do batches of fish. And along those same lines, don't crowd the fryer. If you're going to do 10 pieces of fish, I'd rather see you do 2 pieces 5 times in a smaller fryer than I would see 5 pieces twice and crowding the fryer. You'll end up with a better product. And also, I'm going to throw out one thing, and I learned this from a friend of mine, John Westers in Florida. Fish does not have to be eaten right out of the fryer 1,000,000 degrees. It's almost better if you set it out, make sure it's uncovered so it can steam away moisture on its own. Don't cover it. If you set it out and you leave it covered, it will steam itself and it will get soggy on you and it will not be delicious. But if you just leave it on a rack, not on a paper towel, not on a plastic bag or paper bag, I should say, leave them on a wire rack, which I do with anything I'm going to fry. That's a big game changer. When you take your piece of fish out of the oil and you're like, oh, it looks perfect, and you set it down on a paper towel, well, the paper towel soaks up a bunch of oil in a hurry, but you leave it sitting there for 30 seconds. Well, as that fish cools, it's going to start sucking the oil back in off the paper towel, and it's going to be soggy on that side. But if you put it on a wire rack, the oil will drain off, everything will crisp up, and it will be fine. So a little wire cooling rack is your friend. They're cheap. You can buy sets of 3 of them on Amazon or whatever. It's a really good scenario to do that. And I do that with any of my fish. But I'm perfectly happy to let it get almost even to room temperature. I mean, like 15 minutes out of the fryer, no problem. If you're going to fry off in batches, then eat them from the coldest one to the hottest one. So simple. A couple other quick things that I think can be really good if you're going to fry fish, whether it be with a batter or a breading. The addition of cornflakes can be really good in your final dredge. Just cornflake cereal, unsweetened cornflake cereal can be really good in a final dredge. Another really good one is coconut, and we've all heard of that, coconut shrimp, but I'll tell you right now that coconut fish is just as good as coconut shrimp. I did a coconut bluegill one time where I did a whole big batch of bluegills, and we fried those up, and I used coconut flour in my recipe as well. So I used a mix of regular flour and coconut flour. The initial dredge was in plain AP flour, and then into egg, an egg and milk blend. That's generally my answer is egg and milk for a breading. And then from there into my final dredge. That final dredge was coconut flour and unsweetened coconut flakes, and then in that case you might even double dip them, get a heavy coating because that coating is really good. And then let them set up on a rack for a few minutes in the fridge or the freezer even, and for 10 minutes, and let that coating kind of set up and adhere to it, and then drop them in fryers in small batches, and that is delicious. By the way, here's a real good hack for that. Instead of tartar sauce or something, go get a bottle of pina colada mix. Go to the grocery store, liquor store, whatever, get pina colada mix. It has no booze in it. Take that and mix it with mayonnaise and sour cream and some of your coconut that you put in your flour, and also some little heat source, whatever you want. Cayenne pepper is what I would generally just throw into there, but a little bit of heat as well to offset some of the sweet, and a pinch of salt, of course, and mix that up, and that makes a dip for your coconut bluegill or whatever kind of fish you're doing. Absolutely delicious. So those are some great ways to fry up fish. But let's say I don't want to fry them. Here's another really good one. Say you got a good walleye fillet. Yum, everybody loves a walleye fillet. Take that walleye fillet, take yourself some mayonnaise, season the walleye fillet itself. Take some, with salt and pepper, whatever you're going to put on, just lightly season it all by itself. Again, we want it dry, all the same pellicle, all that as if we're going to fry it. Only we're going to take some mayonnaise aside. We're going to put some seasoning in that mayonnaise, and also maybe some lemon juice or white wine for acidity. Could be some hot sauce in there. Could be almost anything in that mayonnaise. Then brush it directly on the fish fillet, fairly heavy. And somebody out there is going, yuck, I'm not doing that, it's yucky. I promise you, it's not. It will also keep it from sticking. You can then take that piece of walleye and put it directly in a skillet or directly on a grill, and it won't stick because of the oil in the mayonnaise will keep it from sticking. And the mayonnaise itself kind of cooks off, and it just makes for a really rich, yummy, delicious piece of fish. And that is excellent way to handle any kind of fish, is just to brush it with some sort of a seasoned up, flavored up mayonnaise, and then go from there and grill it. And I love grilled fish, by the way. If you've got a nice dense piece of fish and you can straight grill it on open flames, especially with wood, absolutely fantastic. The biggest thing is do not overcook it. For one, if you can put a like a meat fork, like a two-pronged fork in there, and just barely twist it and it starts to flake, it's done. Pull it, because keep in mind it's going to continue to cook when you pull it. And fish that's coming off the grill, you can cover on a plate and set it aside, and it will finish cooking that way very, very gently as well. And if I'm going to do that, if I'm going to hold it for even just a few minutes, I'm going to pull it off just slightly under and let it finish all by itself on the side. So ever so slightly underdone, as opposed to fully done, at which point it's going to overcook itself as you leave it to set. But a plain old piece of grilled fish, whether it be brushed with mayonnaise or butter or oil of some kind. Some people want to do it olive oil, things like that, fantastic. But I love a piece of grilled fish. The key is not too hot. We don't want to char it. You can put grill marks on it, but we don't want to char a piece of fish in most cases. Delicious. I love a piece of plain grilled fish, and always good with a big squeeze of lemon on it afterwards, something like that. If you're worried about it drying out, you can put a piece of lemon on top of it. When you flip it, put a razor thin slice of lemon on top of the fillet as soon as you flip it, and let that just kind of sit there and do its thing, or a small pat of butter or whatever. It will soak in. That's really good. That's another really good way to handle almost any. I'm going to tell you right now, though, unless you have a very, very good surface on your grill, something like a bluegill or something like that you're gonna have a hard time grilling it. In that case, I'm going into a cast iron skillet, not too hot, and I'm gonna go that route from there. That skillet's gonna be somewhere around 300 to 400 degrees when I put the fish in it. And it will cook more gently that way, and you'll get some of the same effect of grilling, but but you have a much better chance of keeping your fish in one piece, because some of that fish is too delicate to be grilled if the pieces are too thin. You really need a thicker piece of fish if you can, a piece of walleye, piece of white bass, something like that. The other possibility for that is, particularly with something like a white bass, is to cook it skin on. Take the fillet, leave the skin, cook it skin side down. So you put it flesh side down just long enough on the grill to put some grill marks on it, put a little bit of heat in the first side, then flip it over, put it skin side down, put a little extra seasoning or fat or whatever you want on the top of it, and then close the grill and let it finish that way on a low temperature, and it will finish on the skin, and then you can just eat it off of the skin. The skin will stay on the plate, the fish will flake right off it. Absolutely delicious to go that route. And that's I learned a thing called Redfish Ryan, fishing with Cajun Adventures in Louisiana. Take a whole fillet off the side of a redfish, leave it whole, cut kind of a trench down the middle of it, like a canoe-shaped trench down the middle where the pin bones would be on a whole fillet. So right down the middle of the lateral line of the fish, they take a V-shaped wedge out and then put capers and olives and tomatoes and onions and things like that in that area on top of the fish, which is again on its skin, and they call it redfish on the half shell. They bake it off in the oven, and it is fantastic. You can do the same thing with a piece of white bass or striper or anything like that, and it's very beautiful presentation for all your friends as well. And everyone's going to show up. You say, "Here, I'm having some fish. We're cooking fish, right?" Okay, everyone thinks you're going to fry up some white bass, and they get there and they get an individual serving of white bass prepared like I just said, and they're going to be surprised. I promise you. The acidity goes a long ways on that. A little bit of butter on top as well for richness. Delicious. I love to do that. Let's move to some trouts or salmonids in general. A couple things with salmonids. You want the fat. So I almost always, if at all possible, cook trout with the skin on. It is very rare that I cook trout with the skin off. I will scrub the scales off of this trout, and in a lot of cases I'll eat the skin as well, as long as the scales have been scrubbed off it. But I'll scrub the scales off it. I'll leave it whole. I'll take the head off, take the guts out, and leave it whole almost always to cook trout. One of my favorites is just to brine them. I use a 5% salt solution, typically with a little bit of sugar, maybe a little bit of acidity as well in the form of white wine's a classic for that, lemon juice fine, and go that route. But I'll give it a brine for maybe 2 to 4 hours in the fridge. Take it out of the brine, rinse it thoroughly, and then again let it form a pellicle. That part cannot be understated for almost any kind of fish or protein, is letting it dry, making sure the surface of it is very dry before you proceed to the next step. With trout, particularly larger trout, I will score them across the flesh, so perpendicular to the spinal cord. And so score them all the way down to the bone in like 1 inch or maybe 1.5 inches apart, all the way down the fish. And that will allow access of the heat directly to the meat inside there, but still leave the fat that's under the skin in place. So it gives you a little bit of the kind of brown, the Maillard touch, to the part of the flesh that's exposed, but the skin protects the rest of it. If I'm going to smoke trout, I always go that route. If I'm going to grill them whole, which is one of my favorites, trout grilled whole is delicious if you can deal with the bones. So bigger trout are better in that regard. And I want to take a quick step back here, because I eat some really big trout, bigger than most of you are going to have opportunity to eat, because I fish a reservoir a lot where they grow crazy. They grow like mad, and they live approximately 6 years, and then they die. They do not reproduce. So if you catch one that's 7, 8, 9, 10 pounds, there's a good shot that fish is not going to live another year anyway. They're going to top out right around 10 pounds. And so we'll go ahead and eat some of those, particularly in the summer when they come out of deep water. And it's hard to release them because they don't do well with the temperature change. You catch them 30, 40 feet down, they come to the surface, surface temps, 75 degrees. They don't deal well with that. And so we have a hard time releasing them. Those fish are delicious, those big trout. Again, you have to score them, brine them and score them. And the brining does a couple things. It kind of flavors them a little bit. It changes the chemical content. And I'm not going to get into too much of it, but it kind of denatures a little bit the flesh itself. It works well with chicken and pork too, to do some sort of a brine, but it makes a huge difference with trout, particularly if you're going to smoke them or grill them whole and not in liquid. The other thing I'll do with trout, if I'm going to grill them, a lot of the time I will grill them directly on the grill surface. In other words, no protection from direct flame. And if I'm going that route with, say, I might with blue or brookies or smaller rainbows, then I won't score them necessarily if they're smaller because they'll cook too quick. And I want as much rendering of the fat as I can, and I'll leave them the fish whole. Again, take the heads off. I'm a believer in taking the heads off because I'm not a fan of the presentation. I understand it's not traditional, but it's just not my favorite presentation to have the eyes of the fish looking at you, and you're not going to eat that part anyway, so there's no point in putting it on the plate, in my opinion. So I'll behead them always before I do that. But another excellent thing is to take that whole trout and wrap it in foil, and then stuff the cavity with all kinds of stuff. I mean, it's almost unlimited. You can put rice in there. You can put rice pilaf in there. You can put orzo in there. You can just put a crab stuffing with breadcrumbs and crab meat and whatever. Maybe you got a crayfish trap and you trap some crayfish. We'll take that meat, par cook them, mince the meat up, mix it with breadcrumbs and butter and seasoning, and stuff it in a trout and bake that trout off wrapped in foil. I promise you, it's going to be delicious. And one of my tricks for doing that is to cook that trout on its back so that it is literally sitting upside down as opposed to on one side or the other. The thickest part of the meat is on the top. It's going to be the hardest part to cook, or is on the top of the fish, I should say. So when you put it upside down, it's got the closest exposure to the meat. Also, whatever the fat that you put in the cavity of that trout will then leach down through it. So an orzo lemon spinach combo, delicious. I mean, literally the varieties are almost unlimited of what you can stuff in a fish. I've done it with clams, just canned clams. Make a clam stuffing and put it in there. Fantastic. But that's a really good way to go about making delicious fish. And the crayfish one's one of my favorites. And again, people don't expect it. If you've got smaller trout, you can make them individual for each person gets one trout. If you got one great big one, it becomes more of a community dinner and serve it family style and go that route. Same thing as if I grilled them whole, if you're going to go there. But that works really good. Let's talk a little bit, and this podcast is going long, and I apologize, guys, but I love to cook, and I can talk about this all day long. Another really good one is to steak. If you have a big trout or that dies, or maybe you've got a lake trout that you can't return or whatever, staking it gives you, in other words, cutting it crossways, maybe an inch and a half thick, gives you easy access to the flesh for seasoning. In that case, it's an excellent way to grill it because the skin will hold it together. So there's nothing wrong with that, but you have to eat around the bones. You don't see that presentation very much these days, but it is really delicious because you can also brush it with some sort of a glaze, maybe a orange juice and soy sauce, something like that. Or, again, you can go almost anywhere with a glaze on top. Could just be a butter and white wine and lemon juice, that you're brushing on top of it while it cooks. Could put lemon on top of it. Acidity, if you're catching a drift that acidity helps with fish, you're right. And that's why you hear lemon or white wine a lot in this conversation. But that's a really good way to handle a larger trout or a larger salmon, something like that. If you have the opportunity to catch big kokanee salmon, maybe a 3-year-old kokanee, be a really good choice for that as well. And delicious. That kokanee needs to be silver still, or it's going to not be too good. If that kokanee's dark red, I'm going to go ahead and brine it and smoke it and go a different route with it because the quality of the flesh degrades as that fish gets closer to dying, obviously. Same with any other salmon. So kokanee, of course, being a landlocked sockeye salmon. So really good there. Let's talk about pike for a minute because pike, no one wants to fillet pike because they're hard to fillet. Well, there's a couple different ways to fillet a pike, and I'm not going to get into that because teaching someone to fillet a fish on the radio or on a podcast is not the easiest thing in the world. Go to YouTube, look up how to fillet pike. There's a couple methods, one of which filleting the top of the fish off first rather than the sides, some things like that. But at any rate, let's say here in my home state, one key thing happens and they want pike taken out of a lot of lakes because they overpopulate like crazy, and I don't want to get into too much politics, but they're public enemy number one in terms of being an invasive species in Colorado. So we're encouraged to eat them. Well, when I'm going to do that, I eat the little guys. Well, they're hard to fillet. I mean, you talk about a pike that's 20 inches long, they're really hard to fillet because they're little and the meat's not very big. So here's what you do. You cut them into steaks crossways, and then you pressure cook them. You put them in your Instapot or your pressure cooker or your canner, and you cook them that way. Same as if you're going to get canned salmon. You season them and cook them that way. Delicious. And you can go ahead and can them and put them away and eat them later. You can use them in that way, once they're cooked that way, to make fish cakes, like a classic salmon patty, only with pike. At that point, the bones become edible. They are soft because you have pressure cooked them, particularly on the small pike. And or your Instapot, same thing, and it will break down the bones and you can eat them that way, and it is fantastic, and it's a great use of small pike. I've seen other guys pickle them. I'm not a huge fan of pickled fish. I love pickles and certain things pickled onions, but pickled eggs, pickled fish, not my thing. But I know guys love it, and that's another really good use for those smaller pike, is to go that route. It keeps you from having to fillet them and deal with them that way. It's quick to cross cut them the other way and go from there. Last thing I'm going to throw out, let's say that you've got a bunch of walleye or whatever that you just caught, and you're going to freeze it. One of the key things you can do once you fillet that walleye, get rid of the guts as well. So fillet the walleye, get rid of the guts, take the carcass and the skin and cook it down in water. Start it in cold water, same as you would a chicken stock, a big old pot of cold water, and cook that whole carcass down. Skim the impurities off, just bring it to a bare simmer and cook it over time until it completely breaks down, then strain it off. In that case, I would put some bay leaves in there, maybe some herbs, maybe some celery, some other things in it, and cook it down. And what you're making is a very simple fish stock. And you go, oh, well, who cares? What am I going to use fish stock for? Well, here's why. Any kind of soup, bouillabaisse, jambalaya, clam chowder, any Italian soup with tomatoes and olives and fish in it, that fish stock base is fantastic. And it adds a depth of flavor that you won't get from anywhere else. You're going to throw those carcasses away anyway, so you might as well turn them into fish stock. And then my trick is to go ahead and reduce them all the way down almost to what would be known as a demi-glace. In other words, once you've strained that fish, the bones and all that out, and gotten the impurities off, now you just have this liquid. Reduce that liquid down until it's thick and syrupy almost, and then pour it in like a muffin tin in individual pucks and put it in the freezer and freeze it. And then you can pop them out of those muffin tins and throw them in a Ziploc and leave them in the freezer. And what that will do then is now you have little fish demi. You can pull one of those out and throw it into anything you're cooking, anything that needs a pan sauce. Say you're going to make it could be anything. It could be linguine and clam sauce with a little fish stock in it. And if you don't have clam stock on hand, nobody wants to go buy jarred clam juice. That's nasty. But if you've got your own fish stock, well, there you go. Bam. It goes great in any sort of a chowder, like I said, or a pan sauce that you're going to do over your fish. Instead of using a chicken stock or a vegetable broth, use a little bit of fish stock in there and do your pan sauce from there. But at any rate, throwing the carcasses away doesn't make any sense to me. And the last one I'll throw out there real quick, because I'm a dog lover, the skin. If you keep the skin off walleyes or bluegills or any of that stuff, if you're going to go ahead and skin your fillets, take that skin, roll it up, and freeze it. You don't even have to cook it. Don't do anything to it. Dog will eat it. Dog will love it. Great for the dog. And I keep the frozen walleyes to the point where a buddy of mine brought me a whole bag full of frozen walleye skins so that I could feed them to my dog, and they're great for their coat, and the dog will love you for it. So at any rate, sorry I went long, guys. I do love to cook a whole lot, and I'm getting ready to go to Minnesota, and we're going to cook a bunch of fish, so it's kind of front of mind for me. So keep this short, but I appreciate you guys tuning in. Check us out at Fishful Thinker, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube especially. We'd appreciate that. Check us out on Altitude Sports and World Fishing Network. We're airing there all the time. Stop in your Sportsman's Warehouse. And thanks for listening. This has been Fishful Thinker, the podcast.